Hello, everyone. My name is Tony Teano, and I'm welcoming you to our Brain Matters webinar this evening. And I work with the Johns Hopkins Alzheimer's Research Center. And one of the things that I do there is creatively try to bring people together to talk about issues in dementia and memory loss and brain health. So we formed this volunteer group of people from various associations throughout the region to sort of be a brain trust and help bring together people to speak to timely issues. This is certainly one of the most timely issues that we have right now in the COVID-19 endemic, and a lot of people having been shut in, they're beginning to really show the symptoms of what social isolation and loneliness can do. So this is the topic of our conversation tonight with some of the world's best experts on this subject. And moreover, we're going to talk not only about what it is and how to recognize it scientifically and what all that's about, but also what you can do about it, how you can help intervene. You may be aware that the US Surgeon General put forth an advisory last week under a Connect to Heal hashtag about how critical our relationships are to each other and how important they are to our overall well-being. It's brain health, it's heart health, it's diabetes, it's chronic conditions. Isolation is a corrosive effect to everyone's health. So we really need to bring each other together and try to connect and heal the wounds that we've experienced over the past few years and make sure that we're there for each other so we can continue to live at optimal health. We're very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Alison Huang, Huang, who wrote this paper called Social Isolation and 9-Year Dementia Risk in Community Dwelling Medicare Beneficiaries in the United States. She wrote this with several Johns Hopkins leading researchers, and you can see how it gets at this longitudinal study about how people who are living alone, have limited participation in society, start to experience negative deleterious effects of social isolation and how it shows up in their cognitive abilities. We also have two experts with us tonight who helped write the Maryland State Plan to address Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And you can see here that the concept of it takes a village is literally at the core of this plan. It's very person-centered. It looks at the life course of people, and it's entirely devoted to evidence-based outcomes and how people can come together and support people living with dementia and support their caregivers. To that extent, there's also a movement afoot in America, Dementia Friendly America, and we have quite a strong advocate with us tonight about this topic. Additionally, we also have a person who helped form a local nonprofit organization that's intergenerational and helps to educate younger people on how they can maybe learn about dementia and Alzheimer's and how to recognize it and be helpful to elders. So the first person I want to introduce tonight is our wonderful moderator, Professor Michelle Carlson. She's with the Bloomberg School of Public Health. We also have with us tonight Dr. Alison Huang, and she is the person whose research I quoted earlier and actually is what got us into doing this particular webinar for you tonight. Then there's Quincy Samus, and she is a wonderful researcher who is one of the leaders to write the report for Maryland. And also she's with the Memory Corps, and she serves with the Memory and Aging Services Innovation Center at Johns Hopkins. She's really about real world settings and how to improve that for people living with dementia and their loved ones. Then we also have Jacquelyn Seth with us tonight. She's the person who created the Can Dream Foundation. She's also a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, as well as the chair of the Johns Hopkins Memory and Aging Community Advisory Board. Last but not least on our list, we have Dr. Claudia Thorne. She is an expert in caregiving issues as they pertain to caregivers and social isolation, as well as part of the Virginia Jones Alzheimer's Disease and Related Disorders Council for the state of Maryland, which contributed to the Maryland State Plan to address Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. She's also an expert in looking at social determinants of health when it comes to caregiving as well as dementia. And now I will turn this over to Dr. Carlson to moderate.
Thank you, Tony. This is wonderful. It's a wonderful panel and an essential topic really to our understanding of what helps us all, not only the old aging, but younger adults to age, think about how we're going to age better. And I think that we have a number of important panelists that are going to be speaking about the different topics that we'll start with on social isolation as an important, really risk factor for dementia. And we've learned that social isolation, based on what we've seen, is as important as smoking as a risk factor for dementia, that we have to understand that we're built to be social. We're built to have purpose in our lives and to be known and loved. And when that purpose, we have to maintain that understanding that purpose is important throughout our life course. I believe, Tony, that we're going to be speaking to the next step is to talk about the issue of social isolation, loneliness, and defining cognitive decline. Cognition is really the topic that relates to your memory, your understanding of your attention, and kind of your day-to-day functioning. And that's really important to us all. And it's really important to maintain that connection with others in order to understand how we have value in our day-to-day lives. So I think we can actually invite Dr. Huang to talk a little bit about the next steps in defining what social isolation is. How do we measure it?
Okay, sorry, I was on mute. Let me share my screen again. All right. So thank you, Tony, and thank you, Dr. Carlson, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to start out with talking about some background and general definitions to kind of introduce us to this topic and map out, our discussion for today. So starting out, social isolation and social connection and loneliness are really important components of our overall health. Particularly since 2020, we've seen that social isolation and loneliness were brought to the forefront of public health and to the discussion worldwide. We see that in mainstream news like the New York Times. We saw social isolation and loneliness included in the National Institute on Aging Strategic Directions for Research report. And we also see it in the research. We see this one article from The Lancet called "Will the Pandemic Reframe Loneliness and Social Isolation?" And also this term of social isolation as its own epidemic, with another article, "Social Distancing Amid a Crisis in Social Isolation and Loneliness." And in the last couple of years, we've also seen a good bit of national attention to social isolation and loneliness. So the left is a consensus study report from the National Academies that came out in 2020. And on the right is the Surgeon General's report that Tony mentioned in his introduction that just came out last week, both highlighting the importance of social isolation, the risk factors for isolation, as well as the poor health outcomes that are associated, and talking about, what can we do and where can we focus. When it comes to defining social isolation, it's quite complex. It's not this one unidimensional construct. And I really like this image. It's from the National Academies report that came out in 2020 that really outlines kind of the components of social connection. So I can walk through it here. So on the top, it says social connection is the extent to which an individual is socially connected and depends on a multiple of factors. So there are structural factors like marital status or how many people are in your social networks, your living situation. There are also functional factors like social support, your perceptions of social support, as well as loneliness. And then there's also a quality component. So the quality of your relationships, whether there's relationship strain, how you perceive the quality of your social relationships, as well as social inclusion and exclusion. And if we think about a more academic definition, in the research world, we think of social isolation and loneliness as two separate constructs. So social isolation is more objective. So It more touches on those structural components. So it's an objective measure of the number or the quality of social connections. And if we talk about how common social isolation is in the United States, recent research has found that 1 in 4 older adults in the United States are socially isolated. And really, since the pandemic, that number has doubled. And for loneliness, this is more of how you perceive your social connections. And it's more of a subjective account of your feelings in isolation, more on the quality side, as well as the perception side. So it's really more about perception. And for loneliness, 1 in 3 older adults in the United States report feeling lonely. And from the research perspective, I can share a little bit about how we conceptualize the relationship between social isolation and health. And this will also help guide the multiple components of our conversation today. So we have social connection, isolation, loneliness in the middle. And on one side of this relationship, we think about the risk factors. So who is more at risk, or what factors, whether they be at the individual level or at the societal level, what kind of factors increase whether a person is more likely to be social isolated or not, or to feel lonely. And then on the other side, we think about the downstream health outcomes of social isolation. And it's all not doom and gloom. So we also think about interventions. What can we do to intervene to reduce risk of social isolation? And what can we also do to intervene to reduce the impact of social isolation on some of these health outcomes? So starting on that left side of that relationship, so thinking about the risk factors for social isolation and loneliness. This is pulled from the Surgeon General's report, which does a nice job of summarizing some examples of risk factors at all levels. So we have the individual level, things like chronic disease, mental health and physical health, personality, as well as demographic characteristics like race, gender, socioeconomic status. I'll put a little call-out bubble to look at my research focus to highlight that. So my research really focuses on hearing loss and social isolation and mental health. So we've got that pulled out here. Other factors from a relationship standpoint include like your household size, the structure, function, and quality of your relationships. Thinking a little more high level in the community, there's things like how much outdoor space is in your community that could impact how often you get out and participate in social activities, as well as available access to healthcare and transportation. And at the highest level, on the societal level, we think about public policies, the technology environment, as well as historical inequalities. And I'll add to that just marginalization as well, whether it's exclusion for how you look, or where you're from, or how you identify. This marginalization and societal exclusion can also really impact social isolation. And on the other side, I'm thinking about the health impacts of social isolation. I don't have a very fancy slide on this one, but some of the highlighted health impacts are for physical health. So things like cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, dementia, and cognitive impairment for cognitive health, which are the focus of our discussion today. So dementia, the diagnostic criteria is impairment in one or likely more domains of cognition. So things like memory, executive function, attention, and impairment that affects your ability to conduct your day-to-day activities of daily living. But before that, cognitive decline, it happens, quite before dementia, and there's cognitive impairment as well. So really social connection we've seen impacts, both dementia at the later stages, but also that cognitive decline before dementia. On the mental health side, we see research that social connection and loneliness affects depression, anxiety, and stress, as well as health behaviors like physical function and sleep, and mortality as well. And our focus today is on dementia. So we see that social isolation is a risk factor for cognitive impairment and dementia. This is a figure pulled from the Lancet report on dementia, the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, Intervention, and Care. And it outlines 12 modifiable risk factors for dementia that were identified in the literature. So, and they occur all throughout the life course. So we have early life risk factors, midlife risk factors, and you see hearing loss here as well, and late life risk factors. And social isolation shows up here in late life. And this 4% represents that theoretically, if we assume a causal relationship between social isolation and dementia, we could see a 4% reduction in the number of dementia cases if we eliminated social isolation as a risk factor, which is quite impactful given the high prevalence of dementia in the United States. And we see from other large epidemiologic studies of older adults that social isolation is associated with a 28% higher risk of dementia over time. And with that, I think we can pause here maybe for some discussion before I pass it on to Dr. Thorne to go a little more in depth into the association between social isolation and dementia. Maybe I'll first pass it to Michelle to moderate this discussion part.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is really important, and thank you for doing this because Dr. Huang, you really point out the importance. 4% is a huge percentage in the population, and we think about smoking as a risk factor. And really, social isolation is on par with smoking as a risk factor. So maybe with that, we can ask Dr. Thorne how about that kind of that risk factor in terms of over time, how we think about dementia or risk for dementia from the social engagement standpoint.
Okay, thank you. Can I share the screen now? Right.
And as we wait for the slides, I just want to make clear that what we do in our day-to-day lives isn't just about avoiding risk factors such as smoking or sedentary behavior like sitting. It's also about what we do with our time. And social engagement may be actually something we don't think about. And so I think as we go through today, we're going to be really thinking about how social engagement is something that's achievable, but we don't tend to think a lot about it, but we naturally are built for it. And Dr. Thorne, I'll pass to you then.
Okay, great. So just to summarize and highlight a lot of Dr. Huang's presentation from the Lancet report, less social contact increases the risk of dementia. Dementia risk elevates in lifelong single persons. High social contact, social activity, and social network is associated with better late life functioning. More frequent contact at age 60 is associated with lower dementia risk over 15 years of follow-up. And social contact has a protective factor that is consistent across different settings and gender. Okay, next slide. Hold on.
Dr. Thorne, just to interrupt real quick, we're seeing your presenter view.
Oh, you're seeing the presenter view? Okay. You do see the presenter view or not? You don't see the slide show?
Yeah, we see your presenter view.
Do you see them now?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, great. I'm going to leave it there if it's okay. So to highlight Dr. Huang and her colleagues' study, and I think this is particularly significant because of the large numbers that she has associated, that social inclusion among older adults is associated with greater dementia risks. More research needs to be conducted on the pathway. As well as social isolation in older adults which is particularly important, that social withdrawal and other changes in social functioning are recognized features of dementia. Primary deficits in core cognitive domains, such as memory, reasoning, and language skills, may degrade social functioning. And so this is all going on with dementia, why social isolation is a risk factor, as well as many of the neurodegenerative disorders give rise to social impairments, such as interpreting information from faces, social perception, recognizing the thoughts and feelings of others, displaying empathy, regulating emotions, and emotional processing. As well as you may know, and you have observed, it can be challenging sometimes for people with dementia to operate within social norms. So just to summarize what I just said, the social withdrawal, the disengagement from community groups, there's a reduction in social ties, there are deficits in comprehension, communication, and interpersonal functioning, difficulty and challenges in interpreting information, being able to comprehend, recognize and comprehend the thoughts and feelings of others, displaying empathy and regulating emotions, and operating within social norms. Are there any comments, questions to be answered? Okay, so the cultural context of dementia. Hold on a second. So are caregivers impacted by social isolation and loneliness? That was, I believe, a major question that was asked. And what we do know from research is that caregivers spend an inordinate amount of time in terms of number of hours per week in caregiving and caring for their family members and friends. And there are significant demands of dementia caregiving. Dementia caregiving can be all-consuming, and it's more stressful than caregiving for an older person with physical challenges. Caregiving impacts significantly employment. Very often, individuals who are caregivers are not able, may have to stop working. They may have to reduce their hours of working. They may not go up for promotions or other opportunities that may present itself. And then there's just a general overall stress associated with caregiving, stress that is related to insomnia, as well as many of the physical health concerns that caregivers have, because so often they are focused on caregiving for their loved ones that they are neglecting themselves. And while some caregivers see it as a burden, for other people, it's completely enjoyable. But some of the biggest challenges, once again, for caregivers is the support system that is available to them. Persons who are single have more challenges with managing caregiving than persons who have a larger support system and good relationships with their siblings and other family members. Shelby, you have a question for me?
Thank you, Dr. Thorne. Have you, do you feel, is this a good point in which we should ask for questions?
Oh, well, I was going to go into the cultural context of.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So the cultural context of dementia caregiving is the beginning of cognitive decline. So what happens? How do you know? You know, I was a caregiver for my mother with Alzheimer's, and I was the person who identified very briefly at a very early stage the changes that she was going through, the changes that, and they were very subtle in the beginning. And if I was not in this field, I would have missed it, okay? But those subtle care changes of cognitive decline includes, and there's a distinction between dementia and just mild cognitive decline that's associated with aging. So what do we see? We see memory loss that disrupts daily life, the inability to plan, the inability to problem solve, the inability or difficulty completing familiar tasks at home, at work, or anywhere. I remember significantly that she would get ready to make a sandwich and she would put everything out. And then an hour later, I would come back and everything was there, still there, sandwich not made. And I say, Mom, I thought you were making a sandwich. And, you know, persons with dementia in the early stages, they know how to cover up real quickly, you know, very easily. Oh, I'll get back to it. I'll just, and so there becomes confusion with time and place, not knowing what season that she's in. She had the opportunity, I took her to see a geriatric psychologist, and it was the most beautiful geriatric psychiatrist. It was the most natural examination. And he said, there's snow outside. What season is it? She said, it's June. And he repeated, there's snow outside. What season is it? It's June. Okay. And he just moved on along. Very difficulty, challenges with words and speaking, misplacing things, losing the ability to retrace steps, losing things and very often thinking that someone has stolen it, decreased poor judgment, which is why persons with dementia are so much at risk for elder abuse and financial abuse. And what begins to happen is the world begins to get smaller, and there's the avoidance of contact with family and friends and neighbors. And then there's tremendous changes in mood and personality, irritability, and those are just the things, the very subtle things that for people who are caregivers, you really need to look out for, because there is a distinction between mild cognitive decline that's associated with normal aging and cognitive decline that's associated with dementia. So there's stress. Okay, for persons of color, minority stress, you know, when we look at the disparities of what happens with persons with dementia, particularly between persons, African-American persons and Latino persons experience dementia at higher levels, but there is racial trauma that impacts persons of color. You know, then we're talking about racial trauma over the life course. There are prolonged incidents that are associated with dementia, with depression and physical reactions, low self-esteem, distancing yourself from the event. There's racial trauma, which is the emotional and mental injury that's caused by racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, hate crimes. And then there's direct racialized trauma. And we see from a lot of the violence that we see in the media, but imagine someone with dementia who has experienced racial and ethnic trauma over the life course. That's also a significant part of who they are and what they present. There are cultural influences on caregiving. There's Black caregiving. Aging in place is particularly significant within the context of family and community, and it really emerges from African culture. We take care of our own, deeply grounded in filial loyalty. Caregiving African Americans have historically taken care of their family members at home. But now what we find, there is a shift in the landscape. Families have moved far away. They're no longer in the same neighborhood. Families are smaller and they're more single persons. And so while the literature showed historically that African Americans encountered less caregiver burden, the landscape is in fact shifting. But also within the Black family, more men are involved in caregiving. In a recent study that I did, that's just recently been published this year in the Journal of Mental Health and Social Behavior, I looked at the strengths and what can we as African Americans, how can we do some things very differently? How can we plan for caregiving? How can we take care of ourselves? How can we bring together the family once again so that there's unity in caregiving? How do you access systems of care, both informal and informal systems of care? How do we African Americans prepare financially for caregivers? It's so important to engage in self-care as well as creativity and to continue to pray. What I think is so important is that when you're caregiving for someone with dementia, and it's so important to move away from this, it's not just the pill, it's not just the medicine. The person with dementia is still still needs a lot of love and support. Once again, there are distinctions with Latino caregiving and the familiarism, which is particularly important, which is we keep mama at home here until she dies. But there are, once again, there are differences within various groups in the Latino community. And we need to really look at the LGBT community. The LGBT community is growing with limited social networks, more likely to age without a spouse or partner. Social networks have become smaller over time, higher rates of many chronic conditions for persons of color. The LGBTQ community needs supportive services, and LGBTQ adults are more likely to put off care, to be self-reliant, and be very, very protective of their networks. So I think that is particularly important as well. So there we are. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Thorne. It's really important that you've outlined the important risk factors and the importance of a network. And that network really starts with the family, and it can radiate out to friends. And we haven't talked as much about community, which we'll move to. But I did want to address a couple of questions that came in the chat. So I think one of them is that family members who have or at risk for cognitive decline and dementia, they may resist social activities. So while it's good for them, they may not see it as good for them. It's kind of like exercise, right? It's hard to tell people what to do. You can't tell someone you need to get out there and be social, right? And so, that's the challenge for caregivers is how do you get the individual to be more involved beyond the family network if they really just don't see that as valuable, and increasingly they, as to your points, they may actually see it as a risk, right? Because they're masking. They know that they're having cognitive challenges. They want to avoid exposure to those cognitive challenges. So they might actually be shrinking their social network in order to avoid being exposed for some of the challenges that they're experiencing. How do you think about that?
Well, I think about that in two ways. One is to bring the social networks to where the person is. That's one aspect. But I think to also be very, very gradual and protective and also, very gradual and protective, and having the person engage in those activities that are familiar to them, that they truly enjoy doing prior to the onset of dementia. Not too much every day, maybe an activity periodically, once a month or, once a week to get started. If the person liked going to church would be a wonderful place to start. But it's things that are familiar with people, that are familiar with activities that are familiar.
That's wonderful, Dr. Thorne. So I'm just thinking a little bit about what you said about the cultural influences. So would that mean that if someone is in a faith-based community or in their whatever they're currently sort of socially engaged in, can we leverage those social structures?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The social structures that you are familiar with, And I think it's really important as we look at the church, as we look at the family, as we look at the neighborhood, to engage those structures. But I think what's really important is this is where the planning comes in place. Like if you know that the older adult that you're taking care of is beginning or is at risk for serious cognitive decline, you know that it's not going to get better in and of itself. It's time to pull the troops together and begin to have those conversations, because the course of caring for someone with dementia can be up to 20 years. And so pulling together the formal, the informal, the family, the friends, the church, and community, that I'm going to need your help, and I'm going to need your help over a long period of time. And these are the specific tasks that you can help me with. That's particularly important, to pull that together so that people can ease the caregivers can in fact ease their isolation during the duration of dementia caregiving.
Thank you so much. I think you really make a really important point too about how it's not a short-term, it's a long-term kind of a collaboration. So I'm going to mention one of the questions, which is, we want to maintain the identity, and we want to respect the individual. And one of the questions is, I'm afraid my parent will be offended as they're very proud and independent. And that's something we all face. I think we're all familiar with that. We want to kind of respect that individual. And how do we address this in a community when we want to respect that individual's identity and their their past and their future? That's our challenge. How do we do that?
Well, I think that's where reminiscent comes in, and reminiscent particularly about their past, the contributions that they made in their past, what they were capable of doing, having those pictures around, and playing familiar music. My mother kept a picture of her degree, around, because that was important to her. And she would always talk about her work. That was important to her. And she would go in and she would go out, and people with dementia, they go in and go out. But it's really reinforcing and reminding them in current time who they are. Not that you were a social worker, you are a social worker, and still claim that strength identity and refer to that strength identity, because you always want to catch the strengths and build on the strengths. That's how you maintain that.
No, that's a wonderful, thank you, Dr. Thorne. I think that's wonderful, is that we are who we are. And yes, and you can't deny what someone's life course. You have to respect what they've done. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful response to thinking about respecting someone for their purpose and what they've done and how they got to be who they've been. And we don't want to deny that.
And it may not just be professional. If the person was a wonderful wife or a grandmother to, and an excellent grandmother and a good neighbor and a great cook, so that, if she, maybe the person can't cook anymore, but she can stir the pot.
That's so
she can
wonderful.
stole the bowl, those kinds of things that, that still give them a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning in their lives.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thorne.
You're welcome.
I like this theme, Dr. Thorne, you have of kind of really meeting them where they're at, whether it's, in how can you get your older family member to be more social, or whether it's like, how do you talk to your family member about cognitive decline? And I think about when you're talking about the social activities part, it's older adults face not just, cognitive decline, there's other like physical impairments, sensory impairments, and it's kind of tailoring those efforts to where they're at. So if they're, hearing impaired, maybe the activity you choose is not really heavily reliant on hearing and auditory function. So I really like how you emphasize that theme of, kind of meeting them where they're at and respecting, where they are today.
And it also, you have to allot for extra time for the activity,
Yes.
So what you might be able to get together in 10 minutes, do allot the hour, because you cannot rush the person
That's
who's
wonderful.
with dementia.
That's wonderful. Dr. Thorne, I think you're playing to the importance of wisdom and knowledge, and we can't, that it takes a lifetime to accrue some of those aspects that we sometimes don't fully appreciate. We have to give people time, as you point out, to recover that and then share that information. And we have to be patient. So with that, I think we are moving into thinking about what can we do? What can we do to help, and I think, Dr. Thorne, you've really set up really nicely for the question of what can we do to help reduce social isolation, to make people feel valued, right? And purposeful, even as they're perhaps in the early stages or feeling cognitive changes. What can we do to reduce loneliness? Because we do know loneliness in aging comes in part with retirement. People retire. Sometimes their friends become more physically disabled and they can't move and meet them in the same way. There are many, situations that, like children moving away. So there are many factors that increase physical isolation, meaning that you don't see your children as easily, perhaps, and you don't necessarily see your friends and your past coworkers. So there can be a reduction in your social sphere if you're not connected. How do we think about, addressing that? And I'm opening that up to perhaps Dr. Thorne and Dr. Huang and others here.
How to address the shrinking landscape.
Your shrinking social network, especially as you reach retirement, for example.
I think, with population aging and that our generation is living so much longer, I think that we just really need to begin to have those conversations, very honest conversations about what happens next at age 65, at age 70, at age 80. There is a wonderful book that's put out by AARP, Disrupt Aging, I think, that has some great suggestions. But the reality is, don't wait until the emergency comes to downsize and you have to sell your home. If you, begin to think about where you're going to live. Is it time to downsize? Is it time to move to a place where I have more social connections and more social support? I think it's important to plan those things, and particularly to plan the legal and financial aspects while there's still capacity. For persons who may be on the lower socioeconomic scale, I think it's important to look at the public sector resources that may be available that can support that transition in terms of Meals on Wheels, transportation, accessing transportation, and having those conversations to live close to family, getting to know neighbors so that one is safe. Don't wait until there's a crisis. Know that as we get older, there is going to be diminished physical and cognitive capacity, and begin to plan for that to the extent that one can. Sometimes these things happen just like that, but to the extent that one can, let's plan for that. Have the buddy system. I know that the state has a call in where you can call and you'll get a daily call once a day. Have your neighbors begin to check on you. Make friends with, the neighbors, and have a buddy system, and really look out for each other, because as you age, there's going to be diminished physical and cognitive capacity.
I think
those networks in place.
I think so. What you're talking about, Dr. Thorne, is really important, because I know as communities come together and people move away, some families have to get back together, and you have an intergenerational household where you have younger demographics. And the work that we do at Can Dream, as far as educating that younger population to remove that stigma and to get them involved and help them understand their brain healthy lifestyles and ways they can support that caregiver. Often we talk about that social media isn't social connections, right? Because we spend time on the internet, but how we can actually have a social life by engaging. And I think we have to take steps as a community to bring a younger group of folks involved because, you know, kids are intuitive, right? And so they may even be able to help with early early diagnosis by recognizing the signs and symptoms. They may be able to help the loved ones by having a little bit more patience sometimes with that older adult, by helping them understand that they can play a role in this discussion, you know what I mean? And I think about like the work we were doing with Delta Sigma Theta, because I wear a lot of hats, but and Joanne is a part of this planning group for this event, and we both at the Columbia Alumnae Chapter and the Annapolis Chapter try to hold these community events where we provide education and awareness and let people know about this on a consistent basis. We do these health education, Alzheimer's disease talks every November, where we want to broaden that conversation, to your point, Dr. Thorne, that we get more people talking about it. So I think everyone who attended this event today, you know, even if you're personally infected or not, you're helping to get that conversation going. And I actually challenge all of you to go out and to talk about it more, right? Because that's what I try to do with the foundation. That's what we do with the McCAB. We're hosting a holistic health seminar in June, where we want folks to come out in the community to do health screenings. And I think that's where you start to get those tips and resources that can help, that sort of goes to what you're saying, you know what I mean? And Quincy, I think you've sat on the McCAB before. What are some things that you think could be beneficial as well?
Yeah, well, thanks. This is a great discussion. So, you know, I kind of look at it from kind of a life course perspective. And so there are things that we know from science now, you know, based on the evidence that we have globally, really, that, you know, that brain health and kind of protecting brain health and kind of healthy cognitive aging really starts in education and childhood, early childhood. So the idea is that, you know, kind of that builds increased cognitive reserve that protects you from later life getting dementia. And so in terms of kind of like what we can do for people, you know, I was thinking about what you were talking about retirement and all of that, like, so volunteering, you know, so civic engagement, getting involved, staying involved so that you're stretching yourself, you're stretching the way that you think about things, you're staying busy, you're moving, you know, your body, like all of those things actually are really important for brain health and kind of reducing your risk of dementia. So, you know, kind of like every, you know, area agency on aging in, I think almost everyone has a volunteer program, and you can volunteer in a lot of different ways. You know, if you're a retiree, like you can get involved, and that will help, you know, kind of stretch you and keep you active and keep your brain active. And then in terms of just, you know, kind of programs for people with who have memory loss already, there are, you know, a number of programs. I think Dr. Thorne talked about the senior call program, where you can set up and have a call daily. And then if you don't answer, it actually calls somebody on the call list to make sure that you're okay. There are also lots of opportunities for kind of, you know, senior centers and community centers are wonderful places that are great and have a lot of different types of activities. And then there's also things called like Club Memory, which we have at Bayview, where it is kind of a non-stigmatized social club for family members to bring in their loved ones who have dementia. And there's specialized, you know, kind of activities and different types of groups for people and for their caregivers, who can then kind of receive caregiver support at the same time. And that's at Hopkins, and it's also at Sibley Hospital as well. So that's just, but here's what I would say. If you're looking for these kinds of opportunities, one great place to look is going to the Maryland Access Point. It's called MAP. And those people who staff that Maryland Access Point can help direct you by understanding what your needs are, can help direct you to local resources to find these kinds of programs that might be appropriate or that might be interesting to you.
I want to also point out that, you know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And I know where I work, because I also work, that we had the discussion. Somebody actually shared a very personal story that they were a caregiver for their mother, and that the EAP program that we offer in our office was very supportive of her and the resources they provide. So even sometimes you may be able to check where you work, and you might want to share that information with employee resource groups and talk to people in that area, because you may have people who are experiencing like situations that, she was very vulnerable and shared this information, and she got an outpour of resources just at work who changed how she operated. Because Dr. Thorne, you mentioned some people don't take roles, they don't take promotions because they don't feel like they can and they're not supported. But once you make yourself vulnerable and have this conversation, I think that you might find that there could be some resources that you are unknowingly aware of, because a lot of folks are either impacted or know someone and want to be that resource for them as well. So I just think that's something else to keep in mind as people are navigating this.
And also caregiver support groups. Caregiver support groups are like the best thing, okay? Because you're coming together with people who are going through your exact same experience. So not only are you sharing emotionally, but you're getting support emotionally, but you're learning about different resources in the community. Having a care manager is essential, because care managers are very, very knowledgeable about the landscape, both the public and private sector landscape. And with an assessment and learning more about your loved one's needs, they'll be able to, in fact, make a match for appropriate services. So I think that becomes important as well. I know when also from a cultural standpoint, sometimes it's very challenging for persons to make the decision to place a parent in assisted living if it is in fact affordable. And that's another option that will provide support to the caregiver. When I conducted a research study, was one woman, she said, I was trying to take care of my mother. I just got to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. And I finally placed her in an assisted living home. And she said it was the first night in nearly 2 years that I had any sleep. And that's where the caregivers have to also really balance self-care with care for the loved one as well.
Yeah, during that, when we partnered Annapolis chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority and the Columbia Alumnae Chapter to host those health education conversations, we really try to talk about getting your finances in order. We try to talk about having those support, and we try to definitely let them know that there is a stigma in the African American community, right, about putting that loved one in some type of facility, that you are not really taking care of them, you pass the buck, you don't love them, and all of that. And so I think it's important that we let caregivers know that it's okay, because families have changed. I mean, now we're working different, we commute longer, we have more kids older, and some of us have, a lot of things pulling at us with activities and all of this, that we just don't have even as many siblings as we used to have when we were growing up. I know my mother had 8 siblings and I only have 2. So it's a lot different to try to be a caregiver as I would be, as opposed to what my parents would have experienced, and which is why we even started Can Dream. I saw my father and my mother both caring for their mothers, and they had a bigger support system, and I struggle with what would I do. And so what I think about is trying to get a younger group involved, because I need to probably have different conversations with my children. And honestly, my big real hope is that some of these kids I'm talking to are going to help find a cure. Like if I'm really just like pie in the sky and really excited about it, I'm like, hopefully they'll get so excited about this disease and trying to make a difference that they're going to go into research. And I think that's another aspect that we could consider. Because once you're involved in those research, you also get involved with learning more and becoming more aware and getting more resources available. So I just think that's a couple of different angles you can take. I mean, Quincy, wasn't there some kind of research you were talking about earlier?
Yeah. So in fact, I'm a health services researcher, so, but it's called Memory Core, and it's a clinical trial that we're doing right now at Hopkins, and it is something that you could volunteer for, and the idea basically is to test whether or not regular companionship that's delivered virtually by volunteers who are 55 and older to people who are living at home with dementia, whether we can, kind of improve quality of life for the people living at home with dementia through kind of the use of these personalized activity plans. And then also we want to see if we can impact the health and well-being of the volunteers themselves who deliver the intervention. So it's kind of back to that kind of that civic engagement and that kind of volunteerism, and how that could benefit older adults by kind of keeping them healthy, both cognitively as well as just feeling good about their contribution to, society. And then, the third type of person that we're trying to help is also the family caregiver who, kind of is able to get a little bit of a respite break when these sessions are being done. And so we're actually recruiting right now. It's all throughout Maryland. And it is people who are living at home who have dementia with their family caregiver. And then also we're recruiting people who are 55 and older who would like to serve as healthy volunteers. And everybody gets a chance to be in the intervention group in this trial. And it actually builds on a lot of the stuff that Dr. Carlson did with older volunteers going in as tutors into elementary schools in the city, so that's the idea. We can help a lot of different groups of people at the same time. And so it builds on that work.
Yeah. And it doesn't sound isolating at all. It sounds really fun.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do is for my students in the courses that I teach, they because they are dementia friends. So they have to go out into the community and host the Dementia Friends Awareness Session, which is so fascinating because sometimes they say, I didn't realize that's what my grandmother had. I didn't know that's what she had. And so sometimes that very basic information that people who are working in the field will take for granted, we still have to continue to get that message out. And that is the message that I know Quincy as chair of the Alzheimer's Council, we have a state plan that we're really looking at raising awareness throughout the state of Maryland. Quincy, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I was chair until January, and then Dr. Amjad took over. But basically, our plan has 5 different goals. Number 1 is to really get the word out about dementia screening and increase the screening rates, as well as support brain health and social isolation and reducing loneliness. Definitely falls within that kind of goal. Goal 2 is to enhance the supports for people who are living with dementia in the state of Maryland, and that includes increasing the opportunities for people to, attend things like, memory clubs and things like that are social clubs, or other opportunities like, adult day centers or senior centers and things like that. And then the third goal is really to enhance and provide more access for caregivers to get support. And then the 4th and 5th goal really relate to the idea that we're doing all this research, we have this great knowledge, we really need to get that to people in practice and for people to receive it who need it, right? And then to kind of track our outcomes, like as a state, like 4 years from now, are we doing a better job than we're doing right now? And so that's our goal, and that's part of the plan.
Thank you so much. I know we're at 8:01, 8 o'clock, and we're probably bumping up against our time, but this has been a wonderful discussion. And I think part of our challenge collectively is helping people maintain their identity, that understanding that cognitive decline is not a disease. It's something we want to think about as helping people to maintain their purpose and helping them to do so in a way that does not take away their identity and does not demean them. And I think that's been a wonderful discussion here that I'm seeing and hearing throughout tonight, is that we want to find ways to recognize the wisdom and the lifetime of accumulated knowledge of a lot of these individuals in a way that helps them to maintain their function and purpose. And the work that, as Dr. Samus said, the work that I do is particularly focused on that. The idea that as people decline, we don't see them as being they're still important and purposeful. And perhaps we need to think as a community about how we continue to capitalize on how people in their later years remain very useful and important, and that they're still the glue of our community. And if we could think about that, we might think about ways in which to harness or leverage that wisdom in ways that don't emphasize the negative, but rather emphasize the positive. So I'm going to end with that for myself, and then look to each of you for a quick moment. I'll start with Dr. Huang, and then move from there to Dr. Thorne, and then Jackie and Dr. Samus.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful discussion. I'll be brief. I think my summary is that, social connection and feelings of loneliness and isolation are just really important parts of overall health. And it's something that I think many of us may overlook or may not have paid attention to until relatively recently with the pandemic. But I think it's something so important to keep track of, just as if you would keep track of your blood pressure or a physical biomarker. So yeah, I think it's, being mindful of that relationship of like the risk factors and the social isolation and the downstream health outcomes, and kind of keeping that in mind. Yeah. I'll pass it on to Dr. Thorne.
She might be frozen.
That's it. We've lost Dr. Thorne. We'll kind of move to Dr. Samus and back to Dr. Thorne.
What happened?
Oh, you're good. You're good. Go.
Okay,
Go
great. Great, good to be back. Plan for aging. Heal those family relationships, because you're going to need each other to come together to take care of your loved one. Continue caregiving can be all-consuming. Get those social supports in place. Still have a plan for your life so you can kind of do that still. Know that the person who's living with dementia is not just a diagnosis. It's not just about managing medicine. And going to doctor's appointments. It's having fun. It's experiencing joy. It's playing with the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. But also, what's really important is to find out what they can do. Be very intentional with what they can do and have them do it well. And even if it's stirring the bowl, that's so important. It gives a sense of accomplishment and pride. And don't forget to pray and rely on your church community. So, thank you.
Okay, and I'll just say, engage with your younger family members soon and often. And maybe dementia seems like a big word. I normally talk to fourth graders going up to 12th graders about this conversation. And, maybe the word dementia that doesn't relate, or Alzheimer's, but certainly understanding that your brain is important and your memory is important, and you can have a brain healthy lifestyle. I think those are things they can get involved in, and just letting them know it's nothing to be afraid of. And taking those steps to be engaged in the community. I know when we host these events, you're taking steps now to show up, but I encourage you to invite others, and be a part of the conversation. Show up when you see these events about the holistic health seminar, when you see the things that Delta Sigma Theta is doing in the community, and certain faith-based organizations. Attend those events, even if you feel like it may not be germane to what you're dealing with right now. You may be able to get the tools to help others, and you never know when it actually may impact your life. So I encourage you all to just, get out there and be involved and volunteer wherever you can. Quincy.
Yeah, and I'll just say, really, I guess the main message is just think of, it doesn't matter what stage you are in life, brain health matters, and what you do, like with your daily activities and your lifestyle, all of that contributes to your brain health. And it doesn't matter if you have dementia. You can, it's been shown that there's, social engagement, activity engagement, can help. And so I just encourage you to just kind of, think about brain health when, in your midlife, in your early life, in your later life, because it really does help. And definitely social isolation is one of those things that seems to be, you know, kind of popping up as very, very important for our brain health.
Thank you all. I'll leave it to Tony to wrap this up, and Dr. Pettigrew. But I think that it's really important. We are built to be social. We're built to have purpose. And that same brain that had purpose when we were 10, 20, 30, and 40 is the same brain we have when we're 60, 70, and 80. Why do we not appeal to the sense of purpose for that brain that's accumulated a lifetime of knowledge, right? And how do we help harness that? So I think we need to build community infrastructures that help facilitate that. So it's just wonderful to hear this panel. And as you know, I think as Dr. Thorne said, you know, it can be something that, you know, just engaging people, meet them where they are, you know, do what can be done, but don't marginalize people because they're not doing what you do. It's really important that we think about how we can be more creative, and how do we kind of meet people where they are. And I think that's probably our greatest opportunity, really, is how do we think about taking this generation of aging adults, and we see a generation, for example, of younger children. And the work that we do in a program called Experience Corps is to try to bring together the wisdom of an aging generation and say, don't let that go fallow. Let's take these aging individuals and use their wisdom for a generation of growing minds. And that's one example that of one of many that we could think about for how we can grow and maintain our community in a way that makes everybody better. So I do feel that this has been a wonderful discussion. It's just touching the tip of many opportunities here. And I think Dr. Pettigrew and Dr. Tony Teano for doing this. So I'll leave it with you both.
First and foremost, thank you so much for being here, everyone. You know, they say that gratitude is an expression of the heart, and you really have my heartfelt thanks for speaking tonight. Everyone here has volunteered their time and talent and attention to this topic for the benefit of the community. It's really great minds with big hearts doing good things. So thank you so much for being here, everyone. And Brain Matters, it's a volunteer steering committee that consists of several organizations throughout the state, and one is national. And we're the people who come together and help set the agenda for what we'll be discussing next. So please reach out to us, find us on the web. We're going to be sending you a follow-up message that has the webinar recording, as well as this resource tip sheet. A lot of great resources surfaced tonight, and I've been compiling basically a bibliography of resources for you for the past several weeks that we've been planning this. So look for this coming to your mailbox in about a week or 10 days. Coming this fall, we'll have a Twitter chat about new research, treatments, and interventions. We have yet to set the date on that, but it will be a Twitter chat. So you'll want to follow us on Twitter at the handle you see there, JH_memory_aging, for updates. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight and listening to our phenomenal speakers. Let's all give them a virtual round of applause. And thank you for being here. This is a conversation that matters.